This is Real Francamente, the podcast. I'm so excited to be here with you. Thank you so much for listening. And without further ado, let's bias your football content. Hey, y'all. Oh, my goodness. We are really getting through these episodes. I cannot believe it's episode 4 with the bonus episode. Really, we've been doing 5 of this is our 5th one of these. Wow, time flies. Responses have been great. Reviews have been great. Keep them coming. You guys are awesome. I love interacting with y'all and hearing what y'all think. It's just so fun to do this, to have a space to really be able to talk about stuff that, that I feel is important, and connections to football that maybe we don't think about a ton. That's my favorite kind of feedback, of folks who are like, I learned so much. I'm like, yes, that's my goal. I'm a natural born educator and I love it. So thank you so much, everyone. I'm wearing my, we're still in Orlando mode, wearing my bias or football content t-shirt in black today. Which I kind of like, right? I like the contrast of the black better than the white. So maybe we'll drop these. Who knows? Look out for that if you want some merch. So today we're going to talk about some kind of heavy stuff, some serious stuff, but with our normal dose of snark and smoke and spice. And I want to start with telling a story. My birthday's coming up. I'm the older I get, the less excited I get to have birthdays. I used to love my birthday. It used to be like an all-month affair. You know, all of February was like birth month, party here, party there. And now it's like, damn, we're getting older. But I bring this up because the story of my birth is really interesting. And I've been thinking a lot about this as it pertains to testimony, right? Testimony in the academia sense of how we tell stories about historical events and how valuable it is to have these stories told, because frequently history is written, not frequently, always, right? Historically, history is written by the oppressor, by the victor in many situations, and the victor in many situations tends to be the oppressor. And so frequently textbooks are wrong. Marginalized communities, a lot more often than privileged communities, have oral histories just by tradition. They don't write stuff down. And so sometimes these stories just get lost, but they're really, really important to share. And sometimes I take stuff for granted, whether it's me assuming everyone knows stuff that they don't know, sometimes through fault of their own, but sometimes not, because we live in a society that likes to whitewash and censor and just blatantly sweep things under the rug. And so we don't get the true history, including and especially when it involves directly what the US is and does. All of this to say that my birth story is really interesting because I was born when my parents were exiled during a dictatorship, a real fascist, right-wing, repressive, terroristic dictatorship. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But the reason this has been on my mind is because a few days ago, my dad, who makes amazing mondongo once every couple of years, it's like his signature dish. It's not something you make all the time. It's kind of labor intensive, but delicious. And I've been Uruguayan mondongo because lots of countries have mondongo. And I had been craving it and manifesting it because I really wanted it. It's like a winter food. And, you just get into like that mood. You get into like cravings. And I convinced him to make it. And because it's such a big, momentous occasion, we were like, oh, let's invite anyone that wants to come over, who's around. Because it was very, very last minute, literally like not even a day's notice. And we did. And one of our amazing family friends, shouts to Carol, came over to eat the mondongo, and she loved it. And she was telling us that she had just watched Argentina 1985, the movie that was up for an Oscar recently. and that she, the experience of watching it was horrifying. Not that the movie is very gory, but it does talk about horrific events that are being talked about in the movie during the trial period. Okay, that's why it's called 1985. And so people are reliving these horrendous moments that were lived through the dictatorship. And that got us to talking, and that got my dad and my mom to talking about when I was born, which was 1984, and what it was like to be in that situation of giving birth, of being pregnant while literally exiled during a dictatorship. Um, and it's stories that are told almost with like a level of like humor, or because when you live through something traumatic like that, you deal with it in different ways. So it was told in like almost like a like a funny way of the things that they had to do while they were exiled and pregnant with me. So one of the most, this is a side note, but I have to tell it because it's so notorious and I had heard it before, but it's something that I had like hadn't thought about in years, was that obviously in the 80s there wasn't social media, but under a dictatorship there also really wasn't ways to communicate that you could trust. So like even phones were probably bugged, especially for folks that were suspected of communism, the big boogeyman word, which is like so flawed in so many ways, the way that this went, of like the suspicions and all that, but that's definitely, we'll save that for another day. So they couldn't really communicate through phone. So they had to communicate with these folks who were helping them out and getting them connections here, and, hospital um, connections and things like that. And so one of the ways they were able to match up with people to like find these people was they were given specific instructions to buy a specific type of newspaper, like a name, like a newspaper type, like not type, but you know what I mean, like the name of the newspaper, and then a brand of cigarettes specifically, and they had to go to a cafe and sit there with the folded up newspaper, the cigarettes on top, and that was the signal for the person that was going to walk in to talk to them, and that they would know that's them, right? And that's how, like, it's things that you see in movies, but that's how they were able to like connect and find the people that were helping them out during this exile. Most of the people in their circles were captured, tortured, never seen or heard from again. And they, were able to be exiled and then come back and live to tell the tale, which, comes with a lot of survivor's guilt and all that stuff. So it's really, really interesting. So, and that's what I was born in the middle of, and towards the end of it, but definitely still under this dictatorship. And the hospital I was born at was actually run by communist Jews, which is a really cool kind of factoid, that in these underground like networks of people that were there to help folks, to help folks in exile, to give them, refugee status and all that stuff. You have some of the most amazing minds, right, in their field. So these were amazing. Like, they tell stories about how they had stuff that in the 80s didn't exist in South America, like Lamaze classes, and all this sorts of like really advanced science stuff. Like, my mom frequently tells that the doctors for me, I was born obviously during that time, during the time of the dictatorship, and they were in exile, right, in this communist Jewish hospital, were there. It was a better experience than when my brother was born 5 years later in Uruguay under democracy, quote unquote, right? And so like that says so much about the value of science, of education, of just general knowledge of technology in this community that gets so maligned, right, of communism, that everyone's like, oh, they're this, they're that. And like, meanwhile, you've got all this proof of the importance of all of these things, including my own life story. So That got me thinking, and, and our friend was, like, listening, so, like, like, just couldn't believe it, and we started talking about the importance of getting these stories out there, right? And in the movie, they talk about a situation where a pregnant lady literally got the baby ripped out of her. And frequently they would take the babies and give them away to their friends as like quote unquote adoptions, but they were illegal adoptions, obviously. But this baby literally was just left there hanging. They didn't cut the umbilical cord, they didn't kill it. Like, it was, like, just one of the most horrific stories, and how people lived through that, first of all. But secondly, like, just how horrific it is, right? And so we started talking about it, and one of the things we discussed is how the US did that, right? Like, this was a US designed, ordered, and backed Operation Condor, that placed these dictatorships, these puppets in to combat, quote unquote, this communism, right? Because of this immature McCarthyism, Red Scare, bullshit fear of communism, they caused all this terrorism really in the rest of the world. And so that I started to kind of realize that when I talk about the US being a terrorist nation, when I talk about the US military being a terrorist organization, this is why. Like, my own history, but more so my parents' history, because I don't remember it, right? I have no recollection, but although there is such a thing as genetic memory and all that stuff, but why is it that we glorify so much the entities that caused all this terror in so many places? Because this is just one of the places, but Operation Condor was everywhere in South America. And so I started to realize that one of my things that I need to do is make that connection more often. I don't just have this criticism of the US and of the military because of reasons, right? Like, because, like, vibes. Like, it's literally because of this history, literally, that I was born in, right? That my parents lived through. It wasn't so long ago, because we love to tell marginalized communities to just get over stuff, right? Just get over it. It was so long ago. It really was not that long ago. I mean, like, look at me. I'm so young and gorgeous, right? Like, you get like that was me. This is my history. This is my story. And so I kind of had this epiphany moment of the way that I'm going to start to make this connection for folks. I know you think this isn't related to football, but I promise it is. And we're going to see how in a bit. But yeah, so I was like, this is exactly what we need to talk more about. And what a better connection than to talk about this as it pertains to football, politics, the 1978 World Cup, which was in Argentina, and torture camps and concentration camps being frequently actual stadia, because that happened in Chile, but sometimes just blocks away from the stadia. So I was like, that's what this episode is going to be. We're going to talk about the 1978 World Cup. We're going to talk about corruption, World Cup corruption in general, and specifically this dictatorship. Now, when I got this idea to do this, because I had this kind of on my docket list of like, this has to be something, right? The 78 World Cup has to be talked about. And I wasn't sure when it was going to come up, but this was really organic the way it came up. But then I was like, oh my gosh, I need to like schedule interviews and have like my uncle and like all my family, my parents like interviewed so they can talk about living through it, which, yes, absolutely is going to happen. But I don't want to do that rushed. So we want to think of this like an intro to the topic, like a base starting point for folks to get some ideas, and then we can look forward to having some content that is people's stories living through specifically this World Cup, and just in general, like what it's like to have those two things juxtaposed, right? These events, these athletic events, the football World Cup, all that stuff, while also living under terroristic dictatorships. And so don't worry, that content will come in terms of interviews and those types of things. And I also wanted to make a connection because, I try in the first segment to like tie in some current events, um, but not necessarily always. But one of the things I did want to mention in terms of current events, and again, this is being recorded, it won't drop for a little bit. So who knows what will have happened by then. But there's talks of Manchester United, who is up for sale, right? Um, Being bought by a Qatari group. Um, and when it was first announced that, that these fascist owners of Manchester United were going to sell, there was a lot of excitement. There was a lot of excitement. And for me, as a United fan, of course, I want them to sell the team. And also, there's no excitement because who has the money to buy Manchester United? Regardless of who you are, who you're connected to, what group you are, it's gonna be fascists. It's gonna be corrupt people. The kind of money you need to buy Manchester United, the brand, because it's become a brand beyond just a team, right? Is disgusting. You don't get to be a billionaire through any sort of ethical means. And so it's like, it's up for sale. Yes, that's awesome. And also, who's going to take over? And the way things have been happening, recently with sport, it was kind of obvious that we were headed in that sports washing direction where we were going to get, corrupt folks to try to bet Manchester United. Now, with that being said, there's also a hypocrisy that comes with it. Now, so because everyone, and this is related to the last World Cup. The last World Cup was in Qatar, and everyone was all the virtue signalers were out, like all up in arms, like, oh my gosh, this and the human rights violations, right? Which is accurate and true. And yes, absolutely. However, we don't see the same smoke, for example, for the World Cup being hosted in the US, which are the perpetrators of some of the worst human rights atrocities in the history of the whole entire world. And so there's no consistency there, right? So folks are like, oh, if a Qatari buys it, we boycott. What about if a United Station buys it? Why is it better to be a United Station billionaire, than it is to be Qatari? Because women don't have human rights in the US either. And not to mention, if you look historically to all of these atrocities that they've committed in the global South. So where is your line? Where is your bar for the type of corruption you'll allow? Right. And so that's kind of where my philosophy lies, which is not about saying don't critique Qatar by any means. Obviously, I don't want, this oil, kingpin money to taint my sport. However, I'm very well aware that the sport has been tainted since FIFA has existed. And if you know football history, you know that too. And we see examples of it. We see examples, for example, in the last episode, I talked about Copa America being appropriated by US imperialism and how I hate that, right? That's another example. Why do we let that slide? Why do we let that slide, right? And so what do we do? How do we responsibly exist as people who love a sport where there's so much corruption, which is every sport. Every sport's corrupt, right? And so I talk about this a lot about not being a hypocrite, but why is it different for Qatar to host the World Cup, for Russia to host the World Cup? Because there was so much, virtue signaling about that. But we're so happy when it's hosted in the US, which is truly no better. And so that's the question, right? Where is that nuance? Where is that connection? Where do we draw the line? And are we being hypocrites or not by supporting FIFA at all, right? Which I think we are. I think we're all being hypocrites, and I think we just need to own it and also realize that there's nuance and there's ways that we can talk about this without putting our foot in our mouth. With the same, in Spanish, there's a saying about like with the, out of what is it? With the same face. Literally, it's like with the same face that you criticize Qatar, you praise the US. That's not like the same face. Like I think in English it would be something like talking out of both sides of your mouth or something like that. Um, it's not consistent. It's not consistent. And there's all sorts of issues with that. So this was a very long intro to getting to the meat of what we're going to talk about today, which is mostly the 1978 World Cup, but with a lot of other different components of what all of that meant. So buckle in, get yourself a drink, and join us after this break for the second segment. Hey y'all, it's Franca. I'm your host for the Francamente podcast, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about an artist that I think you should follow and support. You're already familiar with some of her work because she does all of the designing, the artwork, and the meme creation for Real Francamente, and that is my friend and producer extraordinaire, Elise Lopez. Wow. Clap. We need a producer. We need a clap here, a little clap moment. She's an artist by literal definition, like in every sense of the word, working in various media, specializing in knit design and creation of beautiful pieces, of which, by the way, I have so many. They're so incredible, like so professionally done, so gorgeous, so comfortable. I literally just feel like a queen whenever I wear a piece from her. Like, it's insane that this person's so brilliant. She's an incredibly authentic person who consistently lives her values and puts her money where her mouth is. And there's not a lot of people in the world like that. So there is literally, I swear to God, there is nothing she cannot do. So I implore you to follow Elise and her work. It's at Elise Made on Instagram, and www.elisemade.com is her website. You will not be disappointed. Okay, we are back. So I was talking about how there is sometimes, folks love to have selective outrage, right? Selective outrage. And there's that term, virtue signaling, which I use. And folks like fascists use that term, but they don't really know what it means, right? But those of us who actually do real social justice work, who are on the true, like real left, also can critique virtue signalers, because there's a lot of these folks who do this for superficial reasons, and they don't actually look at the systemic issues, right? And so that's where the selective outrage comes in, where you can critique Qatar and have all the smoke and this and like be so, moralist about it, while sweeping stuff under the rug that your own country is not only complicit in, but committing in the rest of the world. Because we're seeing literally now there's this earthquake happening, and because Syria is under these blockades, like people are just dying unnecessarily because of US imperialism directly today. Like it's literally affecting people's lives today, right? And if we don't call that out, we cannot pretend to care about social justice in any way. It is all connected. That's what dialectical materialism is, right? Like this is what, like it is all connected. This is what we're begging folks to understand. In a global world, right? In a global context. So let's not be selective about our outrage, especially when it comes to these stories that are real life stories that are not that long ago, right? So to backtrack a little bit, I'm going to explain and start with Operation Condor, which I mentioned earlier. Operation Condor was the CIA designed, ordered, and backed operation, which inserted brutal, fascist, oppressive, right-wing dictatorships all over South America, including Uruguay, Chile, and Argentina, which are the three that we'll be focusing on, for just to narrow it down a bit, because otherwise it would be a 7-hour-long podcast. And specifically in the 70s and 80s, right? And so this was an operation that was created based around the immature fear of communism, because countries like Cuba had dared their big, Cuba's big crime was literally standing up to the US and saying, no, you will not exploit us, right? And so, God forbid, this is ironic, God forbid anyone else try that. We better instill this terror in every single country in Latin America, rip babies out of their mother's wombs, all dump people out of planes into the river, literally to die. This is what they did, right? Under this ridiculous, immature Red Scare. So, I have said this so many times, but football is not just football, and sport is not just sport. And this is one of the stories. This is one of the connections that in my life, in my circles, is one of the most commonly talked about as an example of the connection of politics and sport. But I don't think it's as talked about as it should be in the US context, especially with how much of a hand the US had in doing all this. So in 1978, it's the height of the dictatorship in Argentina, and Argentina hosted and won their first World Cup. Now there's comparisons that some folks have kind of made vaguely to the Olympics that were hosted by Hitler, to distract from his crimes and glorify himself, in that literally there's a dictatorship going on in a country where the World Cup's being hosted. It is a little bit of a question of like, okay, is this to distract? Is there more? Is it more, is it more nefarious, the reason why it was given to them? Because let's remember, right? Let's remember that FIFA is an incredibly corrupt organization from the jump, right? Like from the onset. Like, this isn't something that's recent. This is not something that should surprise us. Like, since the inception of FIFA, it has been a corrupt organization, right? And so the reasons why Argentina was given that World Cup to host, we'll never know officially, but it is not unheard of to assume it was to aid them in hiding these horrific crimes that were going on, right? So the corruption from FIFA trickles down to the confederations, right? The continental confederations, but also the associations and federations of each country. So it's not separate from FIFA. It is literally, that is what FIFA is comprised of, right? These confederations and these federations. So it all trickles down. The stadium where the 1978 final was hosted was just blocks away from where the biggest concentration camp, this was a torture camp and prison, okay, which is called ISMA, ESMA, La ISMA. By definition, literally a concentration camp. Some of the most horrific crimes happen there. So now you've got a World Cup final, that, the world's eyes are on, being played blocks away from where folks are being tortured and held against their will at best. Most of them ended up disappearing and, never being heard from again. There isn't an organization. If you're watching on YouTube, you may have been wondering what this flag, like this little like triangle flag I have behind me is. I have it up there on purpose. Maybe I'll post a picture of it to socials. It is from a manifestation, from a like a march or a protest hosted by Las Madres de Plaza de Mayo, which are now the Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, and it's the organization that does work to find disappeared children at that point, grandchildren now. And the name is symbolic, right? Because it's abuelas, and they've won a Nobel Peace Prize and everything, like worldwide recognized. It's abuelas, that they are all of our grandchildren, right? Like it's symbolic, but it is literally connecting families through doing this work of, like, they'll do DNA testing. If, folks who were born between a certain time period and were quote unquote adopted, okay, and have questions about their identity, they can come to the center and get their DNA taken. And if it turns out that it matches, they've reunited over like 100 and I think 100 over 130, I think at this point, children who were taken during that time period. So that is like a because they are traditionally known for the white handkerchief that they would wear around their head, because when the dictatorship was going on, these moms of adult, not old adult, like young adult people, who some of them were pregnant, just had their kids taken and didn't know what to do. So the thing that they thought of was to go sit at the plaza with white handkerchiefs on and just sit there. They couldn't do anything because they would get in trouble, but just sitting there, they were allowed to. That was their way to protest. So that became kind of like a symbol, and that's what that handkerchief is. And Yeah, so that was happening literally blocks away from where this final is being played in 1978. That Argentina, well, not just the final, other games were played there too, obviously. So during the whole entire World Cup. Ironically, this is an interesting one because one of the things that I mentioned earlier with the humor, right? When something as traumatic as this happens, that's systemically traumatic, right? Not individual, but even when it's individual trauma, we also may react this way, is that we sometimes deal with things through humor, right? Or through like at least just talking about it in a lighthearted way, because if you really give it the importance that it has, you may not make it. It's a defense mechanism, right? And so ironically, there's reports of folks who were incarcerated, literally incarcerated, and like this was not a nice little like jail. Like they always had on these black hoods. They could not see anything. They were in solitary most of the time, and they would find sometimes they would find like little poems that they would write in like cigarette paper and like tuck it into the wall. They found like poems in the wall, that this is like how they would occupy their time. But there's reports of them in their hoods and like just being like completely like solitary, celebrating in this prison Argentina winning that final. And so this is like the definition of nuance. We've got this incredibly corrupt event going on, and the people that are the first victims of it are celebrating, because that's what football is. It goes beyond anything else, regardless of your beliefs and everything like that. It goes beyond. It's in your blood, right? Like, also interestingly, the Argentina coach Menotti, um, he was too left wing for the dictatorship's liking. Now he wasn't so left wing that he would have been captured and tortured, because obviously he wouldn't be coaching. But in the same turn, because they were public figures, they did get away with a little bit more than the regular folks. But he was too left wing for the dictatorship's liking. So that was actually a good thing for those of us on the non-dictatorship side. It was like, okay, if we have this coach, then we certainly know that there's players that as well that are left wing, and we certainly know that this is something that can be celebrated as separate from the systemic corruption of FIFA and even AFA and the dictator and the dictatorship, right? These are people that were athletes that, worked their whole life for this, that achieved an incredible feat. What do we do with how can we grapple with that? And if the prisoners themselves were celebrating, there's something to be said about that, right? And if the coach was left wing, there's something to be said about that. So also there's stories about how the team, once they won the World Cup, they had to shake his hand, because otherwise they would have been offed. But they did not dedicate the win to the dictator, which was huge, because in other instances where there were dictatorships and athletic stuff, it was customary to, and under like Franco, under the dictatorship, like Real Madrid, like it was customary to dedicate it to the dictator, because otherwise, and they did not do that. They notably did not do that. And so you've got little moments that you can kind of like grasp of like, okay, this isn't fully bad, right? That's where nuance comes in. That's where we can say, yeah, we can celebrate having won this despite all of this just wild, injustice. Um, the final was played against the Netherlands, and Cruyff, okay, who's a hero among leftists because he was very, very much about social justice, about leftist values. He's very much on the Maradona side of things. And Maradona looked up to him a lot. And so that tells us everything we need to know about his values. Cruyff was famously absent from that World Cup final. And there's many theories on why. But it's consistent with his belief in human rights and calling out of injustice that he wouldn't have attended in protest, right? And then there's folks that say if he had been there, they might have won the final. Of course, those are those things that we can't really know, right? Because it didn't happen and it's a hypothetical, but that was an interesting one. On the other side of that, the captain, the Germany squad captain, his name was it's Birdie, but it was short for something. Birdie Vogt. I don't know how to pronounce it, but he literally declared. So Germany, okay, now we're in 1978. Declared to the press this is the piece of corruption that he was put up to this, right? That Argentina was a country of order. And that he hasn't seen any political prisoners, which is so ironic because they were literally a block away from you. So did you look? Right? No, he was definitely put up to that. And so that's where you see that official hand, right? That puppeteer that was like, hey, go out there and say this stuff. And he had no problem doing that, right? So it's just ironic that they were literally blocks away from where the games were being played. And then Argentina won. And there's all sorts of stories around this of the dictator went into Peru's locker room to be lose or whatever, one of the prior games. Obviously there's no proof with something like that. Some of the players have given interviews on this and they'll say the corruption of things putting that German player up for, to say that stuff is real, but it would have been really hard to truly rig it in such a way because actually the Netherlands came really, really close to winning it and then they didn't. And so you would have to convince athletes who have worked their whole life for this to throw a game, which yes, there's definitely strong arming and stuff. The athlete's position, the player's position is that they don't think it reached that far. And again, we can't judge them as people who didn't live through it, and we can't know what the truth is, right? But we can certainly know and look up to our heroes like Maradona. And when they celebrated that, then we can say, yes, there's a way to condemn this because we must and we have to. And for a long time in Argentina, by the way, the textbooks only contained, for 1978, the only meaningful event that was notable in textbooks was the 1978 World Cup was won by Argentina. Nothing about dictatorship, nothing about, so that was part of that whitewashing. For years that happened, right? We can condemn that. We can critique that. Absolutely. We can condemn the corruption and also celebrate, right? The win. There's definitely nuance there, right? In terms of how we talk about it. I want to switch gears just a tiny bit to go over to Argentina's neighbor, Chile, because Chile had one of the most I think Argentina and Chile had the two most notable dictatorships, the two most brutal, and in Argentina's case, the most volume of people disappeared, but Chile's was bad, right? We have their president Allende in 1973. By the way, it was September 11th. So around September 11th, those of us that are social justice minded in this way will post about that September 11th, which the US just went in and assassinated a democratically elected socialist president to put in their dictator puppet Pinochet. And Chile has never recovered from that, by the way, because it's a mess. It's a big mess. And we did that. The US did that. The US did that, right? Own it, just own it. And so, but I want to talk about this because In Chile, the Estadio Nacional, which is their biggest stadium where, big games are played, was literally used as a jail and a torture camp, literally the actual stadium. If you have heard me talk about the song This Is Not America, and I think I've mentioned it in a prior episode, This Is Not America by Residente, you see images that evoke this exact time period where it was literally used as a torture camp, sometimes while games were being played in the stadium. Down below, it was literally a concentration camp. So years later, when Chile won their first Copa America, it was in 2019. It was also hosted in Chile. There's a player whom I believe has been very unfairly underrated, but it's related to this, why that is, in my opinion. His name's Jean Beausejour. He's a Chilean player of Mapuche and Haitian heritage. Okay, he's always been very outspoken about racism, injustice, classism, and we can guess that that's part of the reason why he has never gotten his due justice. But he played in that final. And then when he was being interviewed in his post-game interview, this is where it sealed the deal for me that this man is about it and like he needs to be glorified, right? He said he's being interviewed like, what does this mean to you? All that stuff after winning. It's the first Copa America. It's the first trophy Chile has ever won, like in their history, like massive, like international trophy. And he said, in a place, something along these lines. Okay, I'm trying to translate. In a place where there was so much sadness and death and tragedy, today we brought some happiness to this pueblo, to this like area, to this, town, which was it was so beautiful and so unheard of and so shocking because we're not used to seeing folks who play at that level speak out like this because we see what happens to them. Now, sidebar, I do want to say with the handkerchief I was talking about with Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, with Madres de Plaza de Mayo, Lionel Messi and other Argentinian players, currently Licha Martinez is one, also Mascherano was one. They do work with abuelas to bring attention to this cause. So, there are some players that are outspoken. And Jean Beausejour is one of them. And for him to have said that, it was like, wow, he really in your face said, and it was like talking about the pink elephant, right? We're celebrating this Copa America final. Everyone's happy, but let's not forget that where we're standing right now was a concentration camp during the dictatorship. And for him to do that, like, that was huge. That was massive. That's where you see that connection. We see a lot of bigots who will say, oh, like, get the politics out of my sport, just kick the ball or whatever, or just whatever. You just dribble, right? If it's basketball or whatever. Sir, ma'am, none of this is new. None of this is new. Folks have been, first of all, trying to decolonize since colonization started. Folks have been calling out this injustice since its inception. And if you haven't heard it, that's on you. But these connections between politics and sport have existed since sport has existed. Okay, and so for Beausejour to say that, it's a moment I've never forgotten. I'll never forget because it's connected. Those countries that lived through this Operation Condor have a connection that's understood, right? And that gives also importance to mentioning something that maybe it inspires other younger players to we should talk about this. It is in not talking about it that we actually lose that history, right? And so like that was a beautiful moment. And yeah, I mean, again, like to not talk about this is literally doing the job of the oppressors. I said on my first episode, we joked around about it. Denounce neutral. It's not only enough anymore to not be neutral and to take a stance, but we need to denounce that neutrality that makes us go, oh my gosh, he made a political statement. How dare you? They are human beings, in many cases, descendants of this exact time period. My history, my family's Uruguayan, they were exiled in Argentina, is the exact same as many of the players who were born around the same time as me. If you look at where they're born, where their parents are from, like that's why there's so much connection, because the countries, the organizations doing good work in some countries were able to take in refugees from neighboring countries in different time periods. This has always been a thing. We have many people have been talking about this our whole lives. None of it is new. None of this is new, right? And so how do we grapple with all this and still be fans? It's hard. That's why those of us that call out US imperialism and the hypocrisy of US national team stands being so openly supporting imperialism while attempting to pretend that they care about justice is a joke. And that's why we call it out so much, because this history is my generation's history. Not even my parents. It is obviously my parents' history, but this is something that I lived through as a baby. So it is not ancient history. Not that if it is ancient history, we should talk about it less, right? But like this is literally, it's living history that the US had a hand in. So I think one of the ways that we can interact, that we can exist responsibly with football, is to pay homage to these instances of corruption. All of them, right? Check people on their erasure of history. I said this on the last episode. Don't be a fucking hypocrite. Because when it suits you, when it's your country, right, we can celebrate. But then when it's a brown country doing the exact same thing, like, no, we have to all be up in arms. Don't be outraged when the World Cup is hosted by Russia or Qatar, but not have that same smoke when the World Cup is hosted by the US. Or even celebrate that. World Cup, Copa America, whatever the case may be. The US is the author of some of the worst human rights violations in the history of the world. It is a terrorist nation by definition, which, yes, we have to live here. Those of us that have to, we have to exist. But that doesn't mean that we turn a blind eye. Blind nationalism, blind patriotism is nationalism, okay? Blind nationalism is what continues to allow these things to still happen, still to this day. Football, in its inception, is the most democratizing sport, not in the party sense, like it's literally the great equalizer, right? However, when capitalism, imperialism, and FIFA come in, they completely ruined it. And that's what we have to call out every single chance we get. And that's why I do this. Thank you so much for listening today. This was a heavy topic, so thank you for sticking with it. I hope you will let me know your thoughts, your questions. I'm definitely going to develop this as, in future episodes too. I hope you liked it. I hope you learned. Let me know if you did. Let me know what else you'd like to see on this front. This has been Real Francamente, the podcast. My name is Franca. I'm your host. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Real Francamente on both. Check out our website, www.realfrancamente.com. You can find lots of content there or contact us directly with any questions or comments. All links and ats will be in the show notes if you need them or want them, or for the ease of not having to spell them yourself. Please subscribe to us on your favorite platform and maybe leave us a rating and a review if you like it, and share with your friends. Don't forget to buy us your football content. Gracias y ciao.